image that we just saw was of the mega event that VLF had organized right here at Chitnavis Center in 2022. India, first and foremost, is a subcontinent. Profound geographical, climatic, and cultural variations color our nation and shape our lives in different ways. With our 75th Independence Day around the corner, we are reminded of the freedom we enjoy today, which has been won by immense perseverance and innumerable sacrifices of countless citizens. These efforts have come to fruition with all of us proudly identifying as Indians today. Apart from our national identity, we also have a regional one. We all belong to different states. Our sense of self is so deeply connected with the states where we are born and the ones we call home that we instantly identify ourselves as Maharashtrian, Punjabi. Even if anyone asks you, you never say Bharatiya. We first say we are Assamese or Bengali. For many of us today, India and its states are entwined together like the threads of a fabric. The borders of our states seem like the small, uneven knots scattered throughout the span of a unique cloth. This imperfectly perfect fabric forms the one-of-a-kind tapestry that is India. The thread of unity which keeps the nation together, despite numerous languages and distinct cultures, has always fascinated me. An interesting detail that I have noticed is not only the cultural and linguistic differences across states, but also the existence of a unique culture where their borders meet. These melting pot regions have their own stories to tell us. Nagpur, for example, was earlier the capital of the Madhya Pradesh state, but now it is a part of Maharashtra. I am sure that there are numerous such regions which have their own sagas to tell us, which I hope we will be curious to know about. Good evening, everyone. My name is Vishwarup, and as your MC for today's run-up event, I welcome you to the Vidarbha Literary Festival. Over the past 2 years, VLF has hosted brilliant authors from all over the country. They have given us tremendous insights into the subjects of their writings, from finance to cooking, horses to tribal life in India, and so much more. We have listened to some deeply enriching conversations. You, dear readers of Nagpur, have been with us throughout this journey, and a loud round of applause only for you. A short request, please keep your mobile phones on silent. Today we are proud to introduce to you Sujata Lokhande ma'am. She is a retired nurse and a recipient of the President Award for her outstanding professional services. Writing is not a new venture for her. She has published a Marathi novel, Footpath te Notary. Her autobiography, माझं Nursing शोध अस्तित्वाचा, has won numerous literary awards, some of which are Akhil Bharatiya Kala Sahitya Akademi's Rajiv Gandhi India Gaurav Puraskar, Vidarbha Sahitya Sangh Nagpur's Anna Saheb Khaparde Smruti Atmacharitra Lekhan Puraskar, and Nirdhar Mahila Sanstha's Utkrisht Sahitya Puraskar. She also contributes articles to newspapers, magazines, and periodicals. Let's welcome Sujata ma'am with her latest book, Sagar Tarashi.
विदर्भ लिटररी फेस्टिवल नागपूरचे मुख्य प्रवर्तक सन्माननीय पवनजी सारडा सर, त्यांचे सहकारी सन्माननीय सचिन जहागीरदार सर, सन्माननीय तन्वीर मिर्झा साहेब, कार्यक्रमाला उपस्थित सर्व वाङ्मयप्रेमी आणि रसिक श्रोते हो, नमस्कार, शुभ सायंकाळ. मी सुजाता लोखंडे. व्यवसायाने मी परिचारिका होते. 35 वर्षांच्या शासकीय सेवेनंतर निवृत्त झाले. मला इथे सांगायला अभिमान वाटेल, आत्ताही परिचय सांगताना सरांनी सांगितलं की रुग्णसेवेकरिता मला फ्लोरेन्स नायटिंगेल या राष्ट्रीय सन्मानाने माननीय राष्ट्रपती प्रतिभाताई पाटील यांच्या हस्ते 2012 साली सन्मानित करण्यात आलं होतं. आणि हा नर्सिंग व्यवसायातील सर्वोच्च असा पुरस्कार होता जो माझ्या वाट्याला आला. हा माझ्या आयुष्यातील अच्युत असा आनंदाचा क्षण होता. माझी एकूण 3 पुस्तकं प्रकाशित झाली. पहिलं माझं नर्सिंग शोध अस्तित्वाचं हे आत्मचरित्र, दुसरं फुटपाथ ते नोटरी ही कादंबरी, आणि तिसरं सागर तळाशी हे व्यक्तिचित्रणात्मक पुस्तक. यापैकी फुटपाथ ते नोटरी ही कादंबरी आणि सागर तळाशी हे व्यक्तिचित्रणात्मक पुस्तक ग्रंथाली प्रकाशन मुंबई यांनी प्रकाशित केलेलं आहे. माझं आत्मचरित्र माझं नर्सिंग शोध अस्तित्वाचं हे वाङ्मयीन क्षेत्रामध्ये प्रचंड असं गाजलेलं आत्मचरित्र आहे. सरांनी पुरस्कारांचा उल्लेख केला. याला जवळपास एकूण 13 पुरस्कार प्राप्त झालेले आहे आणि सगळे पुरस्कार हे मान्यवर साहित्य मंडळाचे आणि अत्यंत मानाचे असे हे पुरस्कार या पुस्तकाला प्राप्त झालेले आहेत. आणि मंडळींनो, याच्या 2 आवृत्ती निघाल्या. पहिली आवृत्ती आकांक्षा प्रकाशन नागपूरने काढली आणि दुसरी आवृत्ती अरिहंत प्रकाशन पुणे यांनी काढलेली आहे. आणि लवकरच ते हिंदी आणि इंग्रजीच्या वाचकांसाठी उपलब्ध होणार आहे. म्हणजे हिंदी, इंग्रजी आणि मराठीची 3री आवृत्ती अशी तीन पुस्तकं एकाच वेळी या वर्षाच्या अखेर लॉन्च करण्याचा मानस आहे. सागर तळाशी हे माझं व्यक्तिचित्रणात्मक पुस्तक. या पुस्तकामध्ये एकूण 13 व्यक्तिचित्रणं आहेत. त्यात माझ्या काही रुग्णसेवेच्या परिघामध्ये मला भेटलेली आहे माझी समकालीन सिस्टर, लेकरांची आभाळमाया, त्या शीर्षकाखाली मी तिचं व्यक्तिचित्रण लिहिलेलं आहे. ही लेकरांची आभाळमाया संध्याताई आहे. माझी चतुर्थ अव्यक्त वेदनेची मूर्ती, माझी चतुर्थ श्रेणी कर्मचारी जी सफाई कामगार डागा रुग्णालयामध्ये काम करते ती आहे. त्याच्यानंतर माझी मनोरुग्ण आहे. प्रेमभंगाच्या दुःखाने किंवा त्या धक्क्याने ती वेडी झाली आणि मनोरुग्णालयामध्ये ॲडमिट झाली. तिचं व्यक्तिचित्रण मी याच्यामध्ये घेतलेलं आहे. एक कर्तबगार वैद्यकीय अधीक्षिका डागा रुग्णालयामध्ये होता, अत्यंत प्रामाणिक, आणि त्यांचा कार्यकाळ हा वाखाणण्याजोगा गेला. त्या वैद्यकीय अधीक्षिका, त्यांचं व्यक्तिचित्रण याच्यामध्ये आहे. रुग्णहितकारिणी मेट्रन तेले यांचं व्यक्तिचित्रण याच्यामध्ये घेण्यात आलेलं आहे. तसेच माझ्या जगण्याच्या प्रवासामध्ये मला जी काही मंडळी याच्यामध्ये मिळालेली आहे ती याच्यामध्ये घेतलेली आहे. त्यात सुप्रसिद्ध समाजसेविका अरुणा सबाने आहेत, शैलताई जेमिनी आहेत. एक क्षमाभिलाची कहाणी या शीर्षकाखाली वृद्ध जोडपं जे अगदी यातनादायी जीवन, एकाकी जीवन ज्याला आपण म्हणतो ते जगत आहे, ते मला माझ्या जीवनाच्या प्रवासामध्ये भेटलं आणि त्याचंच व्यक्तिचित्रण मला समाजापुढे आणावं वाटलं, ते याच्यामध्ये लिहिलेलं आहे. हे 13 व्यक्तिचित्रणं मित्र हो अगदी सामान्य आहेत, अगदीच सामान्य, अगदी माझ्या अवतीभोवतीची आहेत. यांच्या जगण्याने मला अस्वस्थ केलं आणि या अस्वस्थतेतून हे व्यक्तिचित्रण तयार झालं. व्यक्तिचित्रणाचा अभ्यास करताना एक गोष्ट मला प्रकर्षानं जाणवली, ती म्हणजे आजवर महापुरुषांचीच आणि प्रसिद्ध व्यक्तींवर व्यक्तिचित्रणात्मक पुस्तकं जास्त लिहिण्यात आली. सामान्य माणूस हा लेखकाच्या लेखन प्रतिभेचा विषय फार कमी राहिलेला आहे आणि त्या पार्श्वभूमीवर सागर तळाशी हे व्यक्तिचित्रणात्मक पुस्तक अतिशय महत्त्वाचं ठरतं. सागर तळाशी म्हणजे आरोग्य क्षेत्र हे विशाल समुद्रासारखं आहे. त्याच्या तळाशी अनेक माणिक मोठी रत्न लपलेली आहेत, पण प्रकाशाचा एकही कवडसा त्यांच्यापर्यंत पोचला नाही आणि त्यांना बाहेर प्रकाशमान करण्याचं काम कोणीही केलेलं नाही. ते काम या सागर तळाशी पुस्तकातून झालेलं आहे. या पुस्तकाला अल्पकाळातच चांगला वाचक वर्ग लाभलेला आहे. अनेकांनी समीक्षणं त्यावर लिहिलेलं आहे. परवाच्या दैनिक बहुजन सौरभला सुप्रसिद्ध समीक्षक, कवयित्री, लेखिका यांनी दीर्घ असं समीक्षण लिहिलेलं आहे. प्रत्येकाने वाचावं असं हे व्यक्तिचित्रणात्मक पुस्तक आहे. इथे आपल्या विक्रीसाठी ठेवलेलं आहे. आपणही वाचावं अशी माझी इच्छा आहे. एवढं सांगून मी आपली रजा घेते. आयोजकांनी मला इथे बोलवलं त्याबद्दल मी त्यांचे अगदी मनपूर्वक आभार मानते आणि आपल्या वाणीला विराम देते. थँक्यू.
Thank you so much for presenting your book, ma'am. Readers, you can buy this book outside after this session to support and promote our local Vidarbha authors. We wish you all the very best, ma'am. Moving forward, please allow me to introduce our moderator of the evening. I personally know Ripudaman Singh Uberoy as one of the legendary quizzers of Nagpur's quizzing circles. Ripu sir, as is fondly known, is a businessman, an avid reader, a history buff, and a podcast enthusiast. He loves to trek in his free time in and around Vidarbha's outdoors. Before I welcome him on stage, allow me to introduce our author for today's event. He writes stories for small people and big people. He stage acts, movie acts, and voice acts. And he claims to be so tall to touch most ceilings. Not even this though. Venkataraghavan Srinivasan is an award-winning writer, actor, and a brand strategy consultant based out of Bengaluru and Chennai. He's been published abroad and at home. His pieces of short fiction and work for children's literature have been well received. Apart from being a stage artist, he is also a narrator for audiobooks. He has acted in the recent Madhavan movie, Rocketry, The Nambi Effect. Today's book, The Origin Story of India's States, is his first work of non-fiction. Without further ado, let's welcome Venkataraghavan Srinivasan and Ripudaman Singh Oberoi on stage with a loud round of applause.
Welcome, Venkat. Your Twitter bio reads a writer, an actor, a brand strategist, Baiju's presenter, Netflix synopsist. Such diverse interests. Can you go on about it?
Yeah, so I do all of that.
Wow. And
Uh,
what's the real Venkat about?
I think it's all of it. I don't think any of us is just one person. Like you yourself, like the introduction you got was also, I think, as varied as this was. So I don't think any of us is just one person and just doing one thing. We just tend to do a lot of things, and yeah, that's pretty much it. One comes from studies. I studied to be a brand strategy consultant, and so that was my corporate job. Writing comes from childhood. I've always, in fact, when they ask you as a child, what do you want to be when you grow up? My answer was to be a writer. I wanted to write stories from when I was 7 years old, I think.
What kind of books were you reading that were inspiring you to be a writer? What kind of influences were happening?
I read a lot as a child. I read a lot of Enid Blyton, which I think, yeah, Famous Fives and Hardy Boys and all of that. Then there was the usual Tinkle, Amar Chitrakatha. So there was a lot of comics that happened. And as I grew up, I think my tastes also sort of changed. And so I read a lot of nonfiction at one point of time. I was reading biographies, Che Guevara, philosophy, just a whole bunch of nonfiction. And then there was a phase when I was reading only Indian authors, then only translated Indian authors
Multilingual.
from all of our languages translated into English.
Okay.
So I was discovering different forms of books, different forms of writing and authors through the years.
So that was influencing you to get into writing a book.
I've always wanted to write a book, and in fact, I've taken time off through my career as well to focus on writing. So there was a period in 2011, I think, when I took a year off to just write short stories. And I went to workshops. I learned how to craft short stories, and so I just worked on that craft. And then about 4 years ago, there was a children's book spurt that happened. So I was writing a lot of children's books. And then 2 years ago, the nonfiction.
So while most of us were catching up on Netflix lists during a global pandemic, you decided to write a book.
Yeah, I spent my pandemic entirely writing and
Can
researching
you
and
go
writing this
about
book.
the research process of writing a non-fiction book, which is so, authoritatively written about the states?
So actually, I wrote the first chapter, the proposal for this book in 2018.
Okay.
And it was just sitting in my computer. I tried pitching it to a couple of places, but everybody, I mean, it's not easy to pitch to a publishing
Especially a
house,
non-fiction book.
especially nonfiction, especially an unknown first-time
Yeah.
nonfiction author. Nobody gives you the attention that you want. And it's in fact the pandemic is what enabled this book to come about, because the editor that I had sent it to suddenly had time on her hands because of the pandemic. So then she was able to go through all of the pitches, and then she found mine and she said, "This is interesting. Can we develop it?" So I started writing this in April 2020, which
And
is,
the
I think,
research process was all based out of the computer?
yes. So there was no travel possible.
Possible, yeah.
And so the entire approach for this book. So the thing is, the story of the states actually exists in the public domain. If you go into archives, if you go into libraries, there are lots of books, government papers, and they're all accessible. But the issue with a lot of the material that's accessible is that they tend to be very official, very dry, very academic in nature. And reading it is a hard job. Understanding it, processing it takes some time and takes some effort. And my idea behind this book was that I wanted to make it as accessible as possible. everybody belongs to one state or the other. Everybody has family in some state. Everybody calls some state home. I went to school there. And so we all have connections with different states. But the story of those states isn't always available to us. And I wanted everybody to know the story of all the states that are important to them. So the idea is to make this language easy,
For the
accessible
layman to
for the
understand.
general reader. And so the process of research was also that. I read through all of the government books, the papers, the white papers, the research articles, everything, and then simplified the story, the narrative,
Broken it down for people like us.
to make it engaging as well. It's I want it to be a page turner. I want you to be like, oh my God, I didn't know this, and I want to find out what happened next.
So the book is a primer on the internal boundaries, how they changed through the years. Can you start giving us a lay of the land of how this started happening after independence? How the state's reorganization commission, as you quote in the book extensively, how did this come about? How did this happen?
So when we ask anybody about the history of India, our knowledge and our story about India tends to end on August 15th, 1947, because we got independence. And that's it. We're a
British got
country
out.
now. Sorry?
The British got out.
Yeah, the British got out. We got our independence. We're a country today. And the book starts from August 15, 1947, because that's when the real work of building this country began, and integrating the country began on that day. So we actually just got 60% of the country from the British, because the British had two systems of administration
Yeah.
going on, a direct one in the provinces and an indirect one through all the princely states, the 565 princely states. So 60% of the country is what came to India, or the Indian government, on independence. The remaining 40% had to be convinced to join India, or the other option was to join Pakistan or remain independent.
Was that option?
Yeah, those were the three options that each princely state had. And so a few of them that actually said, no, we want to be independent. We want to join Pakistan.
Hyderabad wanted that.
Hyderabad was a contentious state. Kashmir was a contentious state. Junagadh was. So the story of integration begins on August 15th, 1947, when Sardar Patel and his secretary, VP Menon,
The architect
he's
behind
an
this,
incredible man who's just not spoken about
unheard
enough.
of in India right
Yeah,
now.
he's literally the person who went to each princely state and convinced each ruler that they have to sign up with India.
So the real Iron Man would be.
He is. He's the legs of the Iron Man, I would say. He's the person who did everything. And so that 40% of getting that all those princely states to sign up with India took about 2.5 years. And that's why we have the constitution that was adopted on Jan 26, 1950. That period of 2.5 years between 47 and 50 is when all this work happened, of convincing rulers to sign up, of preparing the constitution. That was a separate exercise that was going on. And so finally on 1950, we had a country, which is the next map over here. This is the country that we had in 1950. And these states were sort of created in those 2.5 years. And that process of creation is fabulous. It's fascinating, because it was really VP Menon and Sardar Patel were imagining what the country could look like. To imagine a state like Madhya Pradesh, for instance, because central India was just this network, huge mass of land and huge number of princely states interspersed with central provinces and Berar, the provinces itself. So to imagine that we can get a state like this and bring together Indore and Gwalior, for instance, in one state is I think it's
The
a
Rajasthani
visionary.
princely states were also very, hard
Yeah.
to tackle.
Yeah.
And most of them are very hard to tackle. But can you tell us about how those SRCs came about? That great agitation in Andhra that sparked it.
So if you'll notice here, the northern part of Madras province is still Madras province. And that's what is Andhra today. Now, the line between the Telugu population and the Tamil population is pretty much the border of what's today Andhra and Tamil Nadu. And the Telugu population is actually the second largest population in India, according to the census of 1951. Hindi
Yeah.
and Punjabi was first.
Yeah, but they were
And Telugu
treated
was
together.
second.
That's why they were first.
Yeah, Hindi and Punjabi was taken together, but Telugu was the second largest. Tamil was the fourth largest. So for Telugu to be the second largest language and then not have its own state, I mean, Telugu people were just like, we need a state. And so 1953 is when, after a fast, after agitations,
And the death of the leader.
and the death of the person who was fasting, um, then that's when the government was like, okay, we'll give you the state, because the government didn't want to make a state because they had just integrated the country. They've just brought together everybody, and now you're asking for separation from your other state, and so it runs counter.
Counterintuitive to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so Nehru and the entire government was just worried that
About
it would lead
the
to
balkanization
the
effect.
balkanization, the breakup of the country would happen. And it was important to be Indian, to feel the patriotism of the nation, work for the nation. I think what they didn't expect is that you could be Indian and also
Yeah.
be part of a
Have
state.
multiple identities, as you
Multiple
say.
identities. And so when that fast happened, the death happened, the agitations happened, and finally they said, okay, we'll give you Andhra. Then, of course,
Everyone stood up and said,
Yeah.
how about
everybody wanted at least a commission to look at their problem as well, saying we also want a state. And that's when Nehru put together the States Reorganization Commission.
So the SRC favored linguistic states, that we get. But,
Not quite, but we'll come to
but,
that.
but it was deferred because they wanted integration of the country and wanted to keep it moving forward, didn't want balkanization. So let's get into Bombay, Gujarat. That sounds really interesting how it happened. And still lingering effect in Bombay today also. You hear about, the Gujaratis in, Gujaratis out. Even the governors commented recently, went viral.
So the SRC, the States Reorganization Commission, when it was put together, essentially came in saying that, okay, we're going to approach this on a language basis. Because, I mean, there are thousands of communities, there are thousands of languages also. Yeah. And it's kind of hard to have a criteria that will allow for state reorganization in the country. And even then, there's not one approach to India, which I love. I love that it's a very Indian way to approach things, which is on a case-by-case basis. So the linguistic approach you'll see happens across from the east, which is West Bengal, all the way down to the south, and then back up to the west, up to Gujarat. The Hindi belt in central and northern India and the northeast, they don't follow the linguistic approach. That's a completely different, that's more of an identity-based approach. Like Jharkhand and Uttarakhand, both of them have a very tribal issue at their core. There was a caste-based thing at their core that allowed for those states to be created. Whereas the Northeast has, again, a very tribal approach.
A lot of religious changes also there because of in the Northeast,
Yeah. So, I mean, they're all tribes, and they speak different languages. They're just different tribes. And so that was a very different approach in that sense.
Getting back to Bombay.
Yes.
And,
So the linguistic approach in Bombay, and that's the interesting part, is that SRC followed linguistic across the country, except in Bombay, except in Maharashtra and Gujarat.
Bombay and
So Ambedkar had actually said that he prefers the one state, one language approach rather than the one language, one state approach, which is that it is okay to create a state in which one language is the dominant language, but you don't have to have only one state for one language.
Okay.
So an example would be Andhra and Telangana today, where both of them speak
different
Telugu.
States, but the same language.
The same language. But they're two different states, they're two different cultures actually speaking. And so it's okay to have that approach.
It took so long to realize that they are two different people, I guess.
Actually, Telangana and Andhra have had this issue since 1956. It just took so long for it to happen. But they've always had a sort of acrimonious relationship with each other. Bombay and Gujarat, however, was I think the only state, and maybe Punjab and Haryana.
Punjab and Haryana were also welded together with two different languages.
It should have been two states right away, because there is Hindi and Punjabi, there is Marathi and Gujarati. And so if you're following the linguistic approach, logic says that you should make them as two separate states. And yet, for some reason, the SRC decided that Gujarat and Maharashtra should be one state. And it was a massive state Gujarat and Maharashtra are already huge states by themselves. And together they were 1/6 of India. They were as large as the 50th largest country in the world. So I don't know why they decided to do that. I think they just wanted to escape the problem of Bombay City.
Bombay City was the main,
Yeah,
you
because
know,
the Gujaratis
after
said,
Karachi going, this was the only
Exactly.
commercial center left.
and the Gujaratis said that we've made Bombay. We are the ones who bring in the financial wealth.
That's
And
what they thought.
And the Marathis were saying, no, Bombay is ours. It's part of Maharashtra. It draws all its resources from the hinterland of Maharashtra. So it makes sense for it to be here. The third option was to make Bombay union territory
Union territory.
and
Yeah.
separate out Gujarat and Maharashtra and not and keep the cosmopolitan nature of the city. And finally, the SRC just said no to all of that and lumped everything together. It was never going to last. It was
It took so many years for again
4 years.
for
Yeah.
Maharashtra and Gujarat to start fighting again, and then to
Yeah.
break up and
So I think immediately Gujarat and Maharashtra had their own movements, saying that a Maha Gujarat Andolan, Samyukta Maharashtra movement. And it took 4 years for it to eventually get split into 2 states, but it was never going to last. It was always on the cards that they had to be separate. Similarly with Punjab and Haryana.
It took a
long
longer
time,
time,
to,
yeah.
for those 2 states to get separated.
But some states, this is one thing, but some states have really interesting origin stories.
Yes.
Can we get into one of them first? Goa. It took how many years for it to get integrated into India?
So I really like the Goa story because it happens in sort of stages, like a web series episodes. And each episode is like its own cliffhanger. They're completely different from each other. First, you have the Portuguese, and
Not ready to leave.
who are not ready to leave at all because they said that Goa is just part of Portugal.
They declared some kind of,
Yeah, they
settle-
actually had it in their constitution, and Goa was called the Rome of the Orient and it's part of Portugal. There was no India when we conquered Goa, so there is no question of giving it back to India. Where's India? And Nehru actually, well, India was newly independent, right? At that
very
time.
patient.
He was very patient because he's just become independent through non-violent methods. So he can't go immediately into Goa and kick the
Except he
Portuguese
did in
out.
Hyderabad immediately.
Which he did, yeah, actually, that's right. In 48, he did the police action in Hyderabad. But I think there it was just Hyderabad, so it was already a local internal problem.
And there was a lot of killing happening anyway.
Yes,
So, yeah.
the law and order situation was already quite bad. But also, Portugal is an international country on like the NATO board or whatever. And it's hard for you to like overthrow a Western imperialist power immediately after winning independence from a Western imperialist power through non-violent methods. So he's caught in a sort of conundrum here. And he tried all the diplomacy that he could. He shut down the embassy in Portugal. He cut out trade relations. He made it really hard for people from Goa to move into India. He did everything he could. And interestingly, the trigger finally came from the African nations. Because in the 60s, in the late 50s, early 60s, the African nations were getting independent as well. And there was a non-aligned movement that was
Conference
going on.
happening, yeah.
So in Delhi in July 1961 was when there was a non-aligned movement conference that was going on. And all these African leaders came up to Nehru and said, we can't do anything in our countries until you do something in Goa. Because you are the leader of this. And if you are not going to do something, we don't have the credibility or the motivation to be able to do something in our countries. And so finally, Nehru was like, okay, we've got to do something about
So
this.
we need to thank the African countries for
And
the beaches.
the trigger is really important. And I think we'll find that in all the state stories is that,
And the awesome opinion poll.
yes, the opinion poll comes in. But I just want to dwell for a moment on the trigger aspect because a lot of state movements tend to be sort of just going along and something happens, a trigger happens, which
Tipping
then,
point.
a tipping point, which then converts that movement into fruition, into a result. And in this case, this was the African movement, the non-aligned movement that happened.
And the opinion poll they carried out, the plebiscite opinion poll, what you can say?
Goa almost became a part of Maharashtra. Like you could have had Goan beaches as part of your state.
And cheap alcohol.
Maybe, I don't know. Well, all the churches for sure. But Goa was really tiny. I mean, it's still really tiny. It's one of the smallest states we have. And at that time, small states weren't quite in vogue. Goa had become a union territory immediately after the Portuguese left. And as a union territory, Maharashtra just believed that Goa should be part of Maharashtra because there's already a lot of connection between
And
the
there's
two
a
states.
lot of large Maharashtrian population living in Goa.
Yes. In fact, the main party of Goa
MGP.
at that time was called the Maharashtra Gomantak Party. So there's a large part of the independence movement of Goa also happened from Goans living in Maharashtra. They lived in Bombay and stuff. So there's already a large connect between the two states. Karnataka also wanted Goa, by the way, to be a part of them, but
Karnataka also wants Belgavi.
it's part of Karnataka at the moment. But the Congress working committee in both the states were fighting for Goa, but Maharashtra, I think, just outmuscled Karnataka in that fight. And eventually, when the MGP, the Maharashtra Gomantak Party, won in 1963, I think it was, they won on a platform of saying Goa will be a part of Maharashtra. So they won elections in Goa while saying that Goa is going to be a part of Maharashtra. So when they won the elections, they just assumed, okay, this is it. We have to now do this. And they had to run an opinion poll. And that opinion poll was what would decide the fate of Goa. And the Goans had to vote. So the Goans were given two choices. They could either choose to continue to be a union territory, or they could join Maharashtra. And Goa at that time as a union territory was Goa and Daman and Diu. So all three of these together did the, sorry, Goa and Dadra and Nagar Haveli, not Daman and Diu. Yeah. Now it's Dadra, Nagar Haveli, Daman, Diu. So Goa and Dadra, Nagar Haveli had to vote. And in all the three locations, the motion to remain a union territory won. And it won convincingly.
After voting for a party
them.
which was wanting them to get
So in the elections, they voted for something else, but in the opinion poll...
electorate is fickle.
I guess so. So they wanted governance in something else, and then in this one very, very specific issue, they decided, no, we want to remain independent. We don't want to join Maharashtra. And so that's it. That was what decided that Goa would remain as a separate unit.
Is this the only instance of an opinion poll being carried out? Because they had to do some, constitutional amendment or something to get it, I think.
Yeah, there was actually a constitutional amendment. It was called the Opinion Poll Act that happened. This very specific instance, this is the only one, where you voted to remain either independent or part of another state. But there were opinion polls that were carried out immediately after independence, especially when you had like a Hindu ruler and a Muslim population, or a Muslim ruler, Hindu population. And the question of...
Junagadh happened, and Hyderabad also.
So the question of, should we be a part of India, should we be a part of Pakistan, remain independent?
This happened after independence.
Immediately after independence. There were opinion polls that happened in a few places. There were opinion polls that happened in the French territories as well.
Yeah, the French suddenly left.
The French suddenly left in the middle of the 50s. Yeah. So Chandan Nagor in West Bengal, for instance, had an opinion poll. It was more of an election, not quite an opinion poll. Similarly with Pondicherry. The French didn't want to leave because Pondicherry was this beautiful pit stop along the way to their Southeast Asian holdings.
Vietnam and
to Vietnam and stuff. And the only reason they left is because they lost Vietnam.
In Vietnam
and then Pondicherry had no use anymore. So they're just like, okay, we don't want to keep it anymore.
So moving on, the next interesting origin story is an international thriller, Sikkim. It was supposed to be something like Tibet or something like Bhutan. Yeah. And suddenly changed.
Sikkim actually deserves to be a web series, for sure. It's one of, and I want to write it. It's the story is absolutely incredible. And So there are all these Himalayan kingdoms that are there. There's Nepal, there's Sikkim, there's Bhutan. And Nepal was already sort of its own country.
Always had an independent.
Yeah. But Sikkim and Bhutan were very similar. Bhutan was also part of the British Empire. And for some reason, Nehru treated Sikkim differently from all the other states in India. And there was no reason for him to do that.
But he never said it was a state.
Yeah, his language, and it's there in the book, there are exact quotations of what he says. But the language is sort of idhar-udhar. It's not exactly specific. Because Sikkim was a part of the Chamber of Princes, which means that if any other princely state is going to come and be a part of the state, then the same thing should apply for Sikkim as well. But for some reason, he treated Sikkim differently. And he treated Sikkim differently from Bhutan also. So he said Bhutan is a little different from Sikkim. Sikkim's not quite a state. Bhutan's not quite. There's a lot of nuances that he tries to bring
nuance
into.
in that.
Yeah. And so, I mean, Sikkim was just sort of allowed to be. And they remained in that state for 28 years after independence. There was a king in Sikkim.
The Chogyal's wife was the trigger? The American wife?
No, actually no. So the Chogyal is the king of Sikkim. And the young king who's the heir apparent in waiting, his father is the one who's ruling Sikkim till like the mid-60s. And this young one is the one who's doing all the consultations, the conversations with India, who's deciding a lot of the stuff. And the young one is married to an American.
There's a lot of conspiracy theories that...
Yeah. The American is much younger than he is. And the marriage to that American woman catapults Sikkim into international attention. Because suddenly it's this
Americans are involved, CIA is coming.
It's like a Hollywood fantasy, really, because there's this exotic Himalayan kingdom, and there's an American woman who's there. I think she was called the Grace Kelly of the Orient or something to that effect. And so Sikkim, suddenly the Chogyal found that he was getting a lot of international attention, a lot of invitations. And India was playing along with all of this. They were actually fanning a lot of this stuff. I don't know why. But in the 60s, there was a point where discussions were happening between India and Sikkim to decide whether Sikkim is more like Monaco or Sikkim's more like Luxembourg. You know, one has observer status in the United Nations. Sikkim wants to be a sovereign country. India's like, no, you can't be sovereign. So, okay, we'll be a protectorate country. There are all these permutations and combinations that they're trying to figure out what their relationship should be like. The tipping point comes in the early 70s, where Indira Gandhi has just become Prime Minister a few years before. The war has just happened. Pakistan, Bangladesh war has just happened. And Sikkim wants to be independent, wants to be a sovereign nation like Bhutan, completely independent of India. And I think that really upset Indira Gandhi. So there was a point in, I think, 1971, where she just literally decides, this has got to stop.
Close it down.
Yeah, like this, he's getting too ahead of himself. His head is too full of ideas. We've got to change this direction now. And it was that was the trigger, where he pushed too hard to get sovereign status. And Indira Gandhi was just like, okay, now we've got to stop this. And literally, overnight, so there have always been pro-democratic forces in Sikkim. There was always this opposition that was trying to bring in democracy against this king, against the monarchy. And literally overnight, the Indian government switched its loyalty or switched its support from the king to the pro-democratic forces. And that's it.
Suddenly the election happens and...
Done. Within a year, there is a coup. The masses overthrow the king at his palace on his birthday and overrun it. And the next year, there are elections. And once the elections happen and this pro-democratic forces come into power, they form the government. They pass a movement, a bill or an act saying that we should be a part of India. We want to be a state in India. And so in 1975, Sikkim becomes a part of India.
Keeping to the Northeast, the journey, most of us have no understanding of the Northeast, and the book goes through it in detail, excellent. One of the episode it tells about there's a once in a lifetime famine that happens in the Assam area, and the Assamese government doesn't go out and support, helps them, and Mizoram is formed.
Yes.
Can you help us?
So there's a famine that happens in Mizoram every 50 years or so. It's called the Meitei.
The flowering of
the bamboo, and so the flowering of the bamboos brings in a lot of rats, and the rats sort of destroy everything, and that's what causes the famine. And that happens only once every few years. There's a very specific
40,
period.
50 years, something.
Yeah. Now, the first time this happened when the British were ruling the area, it took them completely by surprise. But after that, they knew how to plan for it and prepare for it. So the famine wasn't as devastating when the British were ruling the area. When it switched to the Indian government, they didn't know how to plan for it.
The Assamese Congress chief minister who was there,
Yeah,
who was
Chaliha.
trying to impose his language also there.
Yes, so there's multiple things that are happening here, but this is the trigger. The famine is the trigger for the Mizoram statehood movement to gain its following, to gain its strength and stuff. Because then there's a Mizo national force that's then put into place to fight the famine, but then that becomes political, and then people like Lal Denga then take over the movement to actually separate from Assam and become a state. The second trigger is the language, where so Assam, I think you can see it there. Assam is this the 20? Can we go back one slide to the 1950? So there you'll see the northeast is almost entirely Assam. There are just two other states, Manipur and Tripura, which were already princely states, but the rest of it is Assam. Now, Assam itself is plains and then hills. And there's already a differentiation between plains dwellers and hills dwellers, just two different people, two different cultures, ways of life. So that's already one tension point that exists. Then the second thing is the language. The plains, Assam, speaks Assamese, but the hills speak a variety of languages. In fact, there's not even one language across the hills. It just changes from hill to hill. And so the Assamese government was essentially just saying, everybody should speak Assamese. And the hills people were like, you're already plains people and you're telling us what to do, and now you want us to speak your language, it's not going to happen. And so that movement sort of united the hills against the plains. And so they eventually managed to break away from Assam to create multiple states. The reason there are multiple states is because the hills are not all the same. The Naga movement was completely separate. In fact, Nagaland got its statehood first, then all the other states. And then you had Mizoram, which had this famine. It had a lot of violence, actually, in Mizoram. Meghalaya didn't have the violence.
District between the state, the district which state within the state, what was that?
Yes. So Meghalaya was actually the only state that sort of achieved its statehood without violence. And it's a combination of three regions, Khasi, Garo, and Jaintia Hills. And there was an experiment even within that. When Meghalaya was formed, it wasn't actually a state, but it was a state within a state in terms of the administrative
The Scottish
setup.
pattern.
The Scottish pattern is completely different.
Yeah.
That's a different one altogether, which didn't work out eventually, where they were trying to do like how
Chambers or something.
yeah, England has its relationship with Scotland, and so we're going to try and replicate that here. It didn't quite work out because the hills were just like, no, you have to give us autonomy. We want statehood. But it was like, you'd say 90% state. Meghalaya was 90% state because out of the 65 issues in the concurrent list and stuff, they were
Most
already...
of them were them.
Yeah, they were already doing 60 of them. So they were a state within Assam administratively for about a year. And then in the early 70s, all the other states were also formed, and so Meghalaya also became a state at that point of time.
So, moving on. In the book you quote Ambedkar, the federation is a union, but because it's indestructible. Do you believe redrawing of boundaries is an incomplete project?
Yes. I think it's an ongoing process. I don't think there's ever an end point to the creation of states or the changing of boundaries, or like even as recently as 2019, Jammu and Kashmir and Leh was then split from one state, it became two union territories.
Vidarbha still has hope?
I don't
Because
know.
if I remember correctly, the Maha-Vidarbha movement starts in 1905.
Yes.
And
So
it keeps
yeah.
on happening.
Yeah, so the thing is actually the approach to a lot of this stuff happens on a case-to-case basis. And I find that there's no one solution that works across. So what worked in Andhra and Telangana may not work here, whereas what works in Punjab and Haryana, again, may not work here. Like they're two different things altogether. Andhra and Telangana is interesting because it's two languages, it's one language, two states.
So are we missing a tipping point here?
The thing is there's a strength to the movement, and then there's a trigger that happens. So if the force of the movement isn't strong enough, and then a trigger has to come at the right time for that force of the movement to then transform into the next level.
Because in the book there's no Vidarbha, but in different chapters, in CP, in Madhya Pradesh, in Maharashtra, in Chhattisgarh, in Odisha, there's a arc of Vidarbha.
Actually, the States Reorganization Commission had Vidarbha as a separate state. They recommended that Vidarbha be a separate state, which again goes against their logic for the rest of the document. Because the rest of the document, they've said one language means you'll get one state. So there was an Andhra, there was the Andhra plus Telangana. There was, again, Punjabi, Hindi didn't work. But the rest of it had one language, one state. But then Maharashtra, Marathi, was the only one that got two states, where Vidarbha should be a separate state and Bombay state with Gujarat.
Parts of Gujarat, yeah.
No, all of Gujarat, all of Gujarat. So the entire central belt of India is where the SRC's logic doesn't hold with regards to the rest of the document, which is what I don't get why they did that.
So basically only Vidarbha is left out.
So Vidarbha didn't become a state. But the interesting thing about Nagpur is that it's the only capital to be moved from one state to another state.
And then not be a capital.
And then not be a capital. I don't think there's another example across the country that's happened.
Most of us know that.
So, yeah. But in terms of the movement for Vidarbha, yeah, it's been there since 1905. And I think in just before independence, 1947, there was an Akola Pact where, I mean, Maharashtra has three major regions, right? There's the entire Bombay belt over here, and then there's Marathwada, and then there's Vidarbha. And so we had the representatives of all of those regions come together and sort of put together this sort of friendship document, a very loose understanding, saying that we're going to share resources, we're going to look out for each other.
You can have certain things.
Yeah.
You can have certain independence, you know.
Yeah,
decide.
the administration is going to be sort of this loose
That's
agreement.
what they told us.
Yeah, so that was the Akola Pact. Vidarbha didn't have such a pact with Madhya Pradesh. They only had it with all the representatives from Maharashtra. And then that was fortified in the Nagpur Pact, which happened in the early 50s.
53.
So the Nagpur Pact solidified it even more. And it sort of bound all of them together. Whereas if you see Andhra and Telangana, they had this friendship. It was actually called the Gentleman's Agreement, where it was literally a handshake between Andhra and Telangana saying, we're going to be together, we're going to be one state. But that didn't, I mean, it didn't hold for, it held for 50 years, but it didn't hold beyond that. The Akola Pact and the Nagpur Pact sort of binds Maharashtra with Vidarbha and Marathwada a lot stronger, I think. It was a lot more.
Didn't it promise certain other things that didn't happen?
No, so that's why, for instance, Nagpur is called the winter capital. It's the second capital of Maharashtra. It has the High Court sessions here for about 6 weeks or something, or 6 months.
High Court bench is here forever.
Bench is here. The Legislative Assembly comes here, I think.
Should come here.
They do, don't they?
Rarely.
Well, I don't know about that.
So
But
now,
that's the arrangement.
as we
here.
come to the last part, we'll move out of the book. I'll ask you about the center-state relationship as it holds today, and how do you look at it? How has it evolved from the last 75 years, and how do you see it going forward? all this acrimony, will this all remain, or is it being, overplayed?
So I think that when independence came, there was no sense of state identity. There was a sense of India identity. We've got independence. And so the center was all powerful. The union government was what was leading the charge, so to speak. And from there, it's almost like how Air India used to be the only air carrier that we had. And then you started getting all these smaller players, these other budget airlines like Indigo, like SpiceJet, everybody. And they start eating out of the market share. Same with Maruti Suzuki. They were the only car maker, and then you had all these other brands come in. So when you are the only leader, the only driver of change, that's an impossible position to maintain. So there's always going to be a more sort of balancing of the relationship between the center and the states. That's always going to happen. In terms of where we are going in the future, I see basically two waves that have happened so far, and I think maybe there's a third wave. The first wave, no, this is not, I'm just using the terms and trend in
not
vogue.
a COVID wave.
So the first wave is really the first 20 years after independence, till 1966. Because up till 1966, it was all about bringing states together, creating larger states.
Integrating it and
integrating
Indianness.
states. Because you had 565 princely states, and so you're bringing them all together into 28 states, which is why you have large Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Rajasthan.
Oh, the Uttar Pradesh name story is
Uttar
another
Pradesh.
thing.
Oh, yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So you have all these really large states because you're bringing them together. But from 66 onwards, which is when Punjab, Haryana, Chandigarh are formed, and Himachal Pradesh is formed, that's when you start looking at individual state movements, and you start looking at how can we do this portion a little better. And so then you have smaller states being created. You have Chhattisgarh coming up in 2000, Jharkhand in 2000, Goa becomes a state in 87, the Northeast starts to become states.
Has the smaller state experiment worked as, governance-wise? Do you feel that it's the right direction, or bringing together and having a big state works?
So here I'm going to quote the Uttar Pradesh example, because in
Uttar Pradesh, which got its name one day before.
2 days before
2 days
it became
before
a
the
constitution, yeah. No, so actually Uttar Pradesh in the States Reorganization Commission document had two opposing points of view. There were 3 people who led the commission, and 2 of them, or I think one of them wanted to, no, 2 of them wanted to make Uttar Pradesh smaller states. And the person who headed the commission was basically saying, no, I think Uttar Pradesh needs to be one large state. And the argument that is there in the document, where one portion of the document talks about Uttar Pradesh, it's amazing because it's so large, it's got all these resources that it can get, it's got the strength of population, all of that is great, so big states are amazing. The opposing note, which the dissenter wrote, said Uttar Pradesh needs to be broken up because small states are amazing. You have direct connect with your populace. It's easier to get things done, so smaller states are amazing. And I think that argument has existed from independence. There's one portion that thinks big states do amazing stuff. There's one portion that thinks that small states do amazing stuff. And the thing is, when you look at the performance scorecard of all of these states, you don't get a clear answer, because you have smaller states that are doing fantastic work, but you also have big states that are doing fantastic work. So I'm not going to take sides. But for instance, Coorg in Karnataka was a really tiny Class C state. It was doing superbly. The SRC has actually said Coorg is doing a great job. They can actually be a standalone state. But they're too small to be a standalone state because they're smaller than a district in Karnataka, so we need to merge it with Karnataka. And till today, if you talk to any person in Coorg, they're like, yeah, we should be a separate state. We shouldn't be part of Karnataka. So
we are still, the ball is up in the air whether...
Yes, but again, Coorg doesn't have the force of the movement. It's just sort of something you...
Like Vidarbha doesn't have a force of the movement.
That is something you have to tell me. Right?
So, as we come down to the end of the session, as a quizzer, I want you to ask some questions to the crowd, whether they'll be knowing about the states of India.
Sure. Should we do the quiz first and then the
Yeah,
audience
yeah,
interaction?
yeah.
Okay. So I've got some questions, some quiz questions. They're actually very easy. But I've
I
also
hope
got
you
a-
did your school geography well. People should have gotten.
Yes, I hope you've read the book because the answers are in the book. Okay, we're going to start with some simple ones. What is the state or the union territory that has the longest name? Even longer than that. Yes, that's right. Dadra and Nagar Haveli and Daman and Diu. They were all merged a couple of years ago, actually. There's a beach on the Arabian Sea and a beach on the Bay of Bengal. Yes, it is Puducherry because the French territory. I think a lot of the other ones we've actually answered during our
Let's see
conversation.
if they remember that.
Okay, there were only two states that were created before independence. All the other states were created after independence. So only these two states have their Independence Day or the State Creation Day, Formation Day, pre-independence. Which are these two states? It was created after independence. So only two states pre-independence. Nope. Yes. No, they were all formed after independence. The answer. No, the answer is actually Bihar and Odisha. Both of them have, Bihar was created in 1911, I think. And it was Bihar and Orissa province, and then Orissa was separated out in 1936. So both of them have pre-independence formation days. Which state had the maximum number of princely states within that territory? Yeah, that's right. It is Gujarat. Gujarat had more than half the princely states, and it's not just princely states. The princely states themselves had like a territory which is 2 states away, and then that had some estate which is another 2 states. So I think in total they had about 800 plus plots of land that they had to then. Nehru called it a crazy patchwork of states. And it's almost entirely in the Saurashtra region, so it was a mess. But
Venkat.
They
Now
solved
we
it.
can move on to questions.
Okay.
The audience questions.
Oh wait, I have some more questions. I'm sorry, I'm going to
We are
ask
running out of time.
One question.
like 2 or 3 more. Okay, I'm going to ask maybe a couple of more. Which is the first one to be formed on a linguistic basis? That's post-independence. There's one state that was created pre-independence on a linguistic basis. Yes, Odisha was separated on a linguistic basis. I'm going to ask 2 more. These are the toughest questions, and you can't find them in the book. So the first one, there's a present-day actor who is the grandniece of the former governor of Assam. The governor of Assam's name is Mohammad Saleh Akbar Hydari. Who is the present-day actor? It's always the Hydari that gives it away. Okay, last question. The former Diwan of Junagadh started a very famous political family.
Can I answer that?
No, you're on stage. You can't. What's the political family that the Diwan of Junagadh, the chief minister of Junagadh, the former chief minister? That's right. It is the Bhutto family. The Shah Nawaz Bhutto, who was Benazir Bhutto's grandfather, he fled to Pakistan, and that's why it's there in Pakistan. That's the quiz. All of you.
All right.
I think all of you get sweets from Ripu.
So readers, now it's your turn for questions. Please keep your questions crisp, clear, and relevant to the topic. And please make sure they are questions and not comments.
Thank you, Ripu, for the conversation.
It was fun.
Yeah, hi, Mr. Subhan. Thank you for whatever you said. We people coming from Vidarbh, questions are often raised about the economic feasibility of Vidarbh as a separate state. So I would like to know from you, they are the right authority to say it. Was any state in India created on the basis of economic viability or feasibility? Thank you.
Actually, a lot of states were deferred because they thought that economic feasibility was not there. And at the same time, a lot of states were not allowed to be made states despite having economic feasibility, like Coorg, for instance. Whereas the Jharkhand issue, Jharkhand was not allowed to become a state for a long time because they thought it couldn't stand on its own. Uttarakhand, they believed it couldn't stand on its own. So in terms of economics, and even the SRC says this, economics is only one of the pillars that they use to create a state, determine whether a state needs to be created or not. The others are things like, can it have administrative, political viability? Is there a populace that can govern itself in that state? And is there, I think they call it force of feeling. Is there a force of feeling within the state to be their own state? And is there also the question of cultural identity? Are they separate enough as a community, as an identity? Are they unique and independent enough to become a state? So there are multiple factors. Economics is one of them.
You refer to a pact, some kind of a pact, signed between people, I don't know who. Maybe, huh. So this pact finally decided that Vidarbha should be part of the Maharashtra.
No, yeah,
And the question is, were we sold short by these so-called leaders when it came to being part of that state?
So there were 4 points in the history of Vidarbha, I think, since post-independence. One is the Akola Pact, which sort of loosely bound all of them together. Then there's the Nagpur Pact, which made it much more formal, so to speak. Then there was the SRC, the States Reorganization Commission, which said that Vidarbha should be a separate state. And then the implementation of the recommendations of that commission, where Vidarbha was not made a separate state. Now, if I trace this, there are ups and downs and left and right that are happening within these 4 itself. And I mean, who is signing the pact? Like you asked, who is signing the pact? It is the representatives of the region. Who is making the commission report? It is those 3 people who were appointed to make the commission report. Now, it is I would like to believe that they were doing it to the best of their ability, focused entirely on what would be best for the region and for the country and for the people. And so given that, I think that what has happened is, I mean, again, there's no right route that you can take. It's not a very black or white, clear yes or no answer. And we'll see that across states that when you look back in hindsight, you think, my God, you missed this opportunity, or you should have done that instead of this. Every time I read Kashmir, I feel that there was a missed opportunity there. Like I said earlier, it's not a full stop, however. The state reorganization, the boundaries, it's always ongoing. There's always changes that are coming up. And so, yeah, I wouldn't say it's the final end of how our states are going to look like. I don't know what the future holds, though. So,
Self-governance has been one of the drivers behind various kinds of reorganization. Self-governance has been the driver behind reorganization. How much impact has Panchayati Raj or third level of government had in dissipating some of those energies of wanting to have a statehood?
That's a great question, because Panchayati Raj is a factor in what happened in the Northeast, in Arunachal Pradesh. Panchayati Raj actually is one of the reasons that that state eventually managed to get sort of a cohesive political identity. And that Panchayati Raj was based on a Panchayati Raj that was introduced in I think, northern India, in UP, if I'm not wrong. So there is a very strong grassroots Panchayati Raj system that exists, which does a fantastic job of bringing political consciousness to the masses in that sense. And there have been, I mean, Arunachal Pradesh is the greatest example of that Panchayati Raj then sort of leveling up and leading to a creation of a state. But yeah, Panchayati Raj definitely exists in a lot of places as a lot of people's first interaction with politics or with administration, or to that sense. So yeah, Panchayati Raj is, I'm a big proponent of Panchayati Raj.
Hi. This is related to writing. So, before that, my sister just suggested that your book should be introduced in our curriculum for the schools, because we don't know about it, like,
Yes.
even as adults. But apart from this, I stalked you online and I read your interview. And in that, you had said that you gave yourself a deadline of a year. And then you wrote like you gave 10 days to each state. But for a fiction writer, like who is a master procrastinator, like I've been trying to write a book for the past 5 years. I've only written down my character sketches. So what do you think is like, what advice would you give? Like what kind of ecosystem should we have? I don't think I'm motivated enough to give myself deadlines like you did. And maybe you did it because of the pandemic also.
Because I had a
But
contract.
also, yeah, you heard back from them. So yeah, but is there something that you would want to like just give away the resources? I also read that you went to a lot of writing workshops. Did that help? And how can a budding writer go about it?
Great question. So it's a tough one to answer. Writing workshops definitely helped. I found that every time I was getting stuck and I went to a writing workshop, it forced me to think and forced me to write. And I found that when I'd come back from the workshop, there was a free flow of ideas and of writing that was happening. In terms of discipline for writing, the deadline helped for sure, saying that, okay, I have a 1-year deadline. But then the 10-day deadline really helped as well, because I gave myself an average of 10 days per state. So I knew that I would have to do my research, I'd have to do my writing, figuring out the narrative, everything within 10 days. It wasn't always 10 days. Some of them were longer, some of them were shorter. But because of that 10 days, I was then able to do a shorter sort of schedule, saying that I'm going to read for the next 2 days, figure out what the story is. Then I'm going to put down who are the main characters, what the narrative arc is over the next 2 days. Then I'm going to write it down and then maybe edit it once. So that quick, tight deadline really helped. I also found that, so I've also struggled with fiction manuscripts. And I've also, so in 2018, before I got to this, I actually wrote a first draft of a fiction manuscript, which is horrible, but there's a first draft. And to do that, I had like large chunks of, large blocks of my day, saying that from morning till breakfast, I'm going to write. Breakfast to morning tea, I'm going to write. And then the afternoon, I'm going to read. And so I just had these 2 or 3 things I had to do, which was to write in the morning and then read in the afternoon. And I didn't really care about what I was writing. The important thing was that I was writing it. Because I knew that I could come back and edit it. Editing is so much easier than writing. So I think the thing is to just sort of wake up, sit every day like it's an office, just show up every day and write, just write, yeah. Sorry, that's all I can say.
Hello, sir. I'm a Malayali, but my hometown is in Kanyakumari district, which became a part of Tamil Nadu in 56. And my wife is from Palakkad, and Palakkad was a part of Kerala after 56. So whenever we have an argument, it eventually comes out to one's identity, whether who is the real Malayali amongst us. So why did the SRC create this family crisis? That's why I want to know.
Yeah, that's about the Malayali crisis.
So the thing was, there are all these little tehsils within a district, right? They're smaller breakups of the district itself. In terms of deciding which district should go to which state, it was all based on population, the census. So if there were more Bengali speakers than Hindi speakers, it will go to Bengal. It will not come to Bihar. Similarly with Tamil Nadu and Kerala. Places like Coimbatore district, for instance, were actually broken down in half because this part of Coimbatore district had more Kannada speakers, and so it came to Karnataka. Whereas the others, so it was, I think it's literally down to that thing. So if your house had been on the other side of the road, then you might have been in the other state. But in terms of the SRC solving a marital problems, I don't know how to do that.
Yeah, I have got one more question. And I want you to think about it and give it a proper answer because it's regarding Vidarbha. On 15th of August 1947, was there a Vidarbha and was there a Maharashtra through your entire thing?
No, it wasn't there. There were no states that were formed at that time.
Yeah.
So there's a regional identity that exists. But I've also seen that there is a Vidarbha and a Nagpur division, where Vidarbha is Akola and Amravati and a couple of other. No.
CP and
No.
Bera is different.
No.
That's the whole state.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that I've actually read that there is a division in Vidarbha, back then I'm saying, where people identified as Nagpur division and Vidarbha division. Right, yeah. So in terms of regional identity, there is a regional identity that exists. But how far are you thinking? Because
On 15th August 1947, did there exist a Maharashtra?
no.
That's the answer.
That's it. Last question.
Was there any suggestion that the state reorganization should not be on linguistic basis, but you should draw horizontal and vertical lines?
No. That was there in the US, but that's because it was a colonial approach, imperialist approach to cutting up even Africa has straight lines. Here it was already existing princely states that were then put together. Oh, there was a Samyukt Maharashtra movement in 1946 though. So there was... No, there was a Maharashtra movement that existed pre-independence. So there was no Maharashtra, but there was a movement for it.
I have it interesting, it just occurred to me, it might be completely silly. CPN Berar, was it ever CPN Varhad? And therefore Varhad Vidarbha. So with reference to your question there.
Yeah, I
So
think...
can that be the answer
I-
to his question, that CPN Berar, central provinces and Varhad, because the English couldn't get their tongues around Varhad.
Yeah, so I think Berar is a corruption of the term Vidarbha, if I'm not wrong.
So, yeah. Yeah. I am architect Amol Vanzari. I am co-founder of Orange ODC and we take
Great organization.
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah. So, Varhad was there, a region, and there was this language in this region which was Dakhani in Hyderabad. So, these Nizams were ruling at that time in this region. So, in Dakhani, they used to call it Barhad. So, when these Britishers came, they couldn't say Barhad, so that was corruption of, yeah. Yeah, Varhad became Bera. Oh, okay.
So she was right, I think. Okay, thank you very much, guys. I think we are done.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you also, ma'am, for presenting your book. Unfortunately, I don't read Marathi, but thank you. I hope it gets translated to English so that I can read your book. Thank you.
Today's book certainly took us through each state. We could witness its past, and now we can see the present play in front of us. Let us delve deeper into the stories which have shaped our states and in turn our great nation. I hope the quiz certainly woke up your brain cells and instigated you to read this book. Thank you, readers, for being a great audience. I request our volunteer, Sanya Firdaus, to present our author with a one-of-a-kind painting from the Alag Angle community made by Sharvari Revatkar, a class 12 student. She is also a student and for this author. I would now like to invite Sachin Jahagirdar, VLF Secretary, to address our readers with a closing remark and the vote of thanks. Let's welcome him with a round of applause.
So I was told that this day falls on a long weekend ahead, and we were very skeptical to have a good audience to have this session full. But thank you all for coming here, joining us. And so, the one thing that binds all of us together is books. The love for reading of the books. And that's why we must thank all the authors who are coming here to Nagpur and all the publishers who publish those books. Otherwise, our existence is in trouble. And now that you are here and avoided your long weekend starting tomorrow, I'm going to give you a fantastic reward for being here. The book is MRP is 400 rupees. Crossword is offering 50 rupees discount. We are offering 100 rupees discount. So, good deal. It's 250 rupees available outside at the end of this session. Also, we come in front of you every month. The next run-up event is on 17th of September. She's Anita Bhogle. She's alumnus of IIT Bombay, IIM Ahmedabad. She runs this series of lectures called The Winning Way with her husband Harsha Bhogle. And she's going to talk about a book called Equal Yet Different. So, see you at the same time, same place. Also, I would like to thank our title sponsors for this VLF coming up in February 23. That is Vishwaraj Infra. Also, the other sponsors, SMS and Calderies. Our friends in the media who support us unconditionally. And I look forward to you again on 17 September. Please buy books, all the books that are available on the stalls. Thanks a lot. Thank
If you enjoyed this session, do feel free to interact with the author and buy his first non-fiction book, The Origin Story of India's States, right outside this room. In partnership with Crossword VLF, as Sachin has already told you, we are offering you a rupees 150 discount, flat rupees 150 discount, and it is available for 250 rupees. Take it and get it signed by the author, and you can have as much discussion as you want, which you couldn't have during the Q&A session after this event at his convenience. Thank you everyone, have a great evening and a happy Independence Day ahead.